Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm very happy that you are here. And the only problem is that I still have some problem understanding why you're coming. Maybe it's because you're in love with poetry or in love with science, I suppose, or both, or something like that. So this, I can guess it. The only thing that I still don't understand when you come is who the hell are you? No, really, I'm asking, who are you? See, who are you? I know what you're thinking. I think it's a very irritating question, right? Very arrogant, irritating question.
No, we're just wondering if it's rhetorical or if you want us to answer.
No, it wasn't a rhetoric question, and rhetoric questions do not need answers. Thank you.
I was asking, is it rhetorical or do you need answers?
It's just a talk. But then at the end, if you want to talk, you can ask questions.
Oh, we can?
Yes, but I like you. Who are you?
I just didn't know, who's asking the question.
See, this question, it looks very simple, right? Because I'm not asking if there is a God. I'm not asking why there is something instead of nothing, right? I'm not asking what is the task of the human beings. I'm just asking who are you? It's a talk. I just know it by heart. I'm just asking who are you, right? But see, even if you are so sure that you are you, if I ask you, you don't even know from where to start. Your name, Benjamin. Yeah, I was talking with you. Benjamin, Claire. But see, there is something inside you that says to you that you're not just your name. You must be much more than just your name. Benjamin, Paul, huh? Okay, get rid of your name. What else we have? Your job. You're an architect. No. You're a musician. No. A plumber. You are a plumber. This is good. See, but you are much more than your job. Something is saying to you, you're much more than your job. You are much more than those pipes. I like this one. You're much more than just those pipes. Huh? Something insane. Wait, what is left? What is left now? Your family, yes. You come from a very rich family somewhere in the north of France. A bourgeois family. You've done the more prestigious, it's just a script. You've done the most prestigious school. Huh? The Sorbonne, the Louvre, Sciences Po. But you're not just your education, right? You're not just a PhD, right? But you see, the more you get rid of all these things, and the less you know who you are. It's funny, right? It's really funny. So you're not your job, oh yes, you are your age. You're 28, right? You're not 28. You're not 28 because otherwise it means that you were not you when you were 27. Surrender. Just surrender to this multiplicity of the self. You are many, you're not just one. You're your job, your education, you're your family, you're your dreams, shitty days, bad days, good days. Holly Pester and Emma Bennett, they are two poets and two artists. They work together. When they are alone, probably Holly Pester is Holly Pester and Emma Bennett is Emma Bennett. But when they are together, it's strange because when they are together, they are less than two and more than one. And that's why they're here. I invited them to tell us how it feels like to be so many and mostly no one. What is left now? What is left? The soul. A question mark, yes. But before the question mark, and then we will go into the brain, but before the question mark, what is left is the soul, because maybe you think you have a soul. Do you have a soul? Maybe you think that there is something that is more you than you and more stable than you, that all this changing. Maybe you think you have a soul. Or maybe you think that you belong to Gaia, and then to Gaia you will get back. Right? Once you die, you will become a hippie. That's what Dorothea Lasky says. See, because once you die, you will get back to the earth, between mushrooms and mud, and worms and flies, huh? And at the end, you will become organic, right? Like a hippie, even if you don't want it. That's why I invited her here, to tell us something about bees and pollen, and compost and organics, and the body. There is this beautiful poem. She says, more or less, she said, see, everything is unreal. Even the real that does not help, it becomes unreal. But don't worry, baby. Don't worry. These boobs are real. You will see when she gets in. That's why I invited her here. And then, of course, we are left with this self that keeps telling us that we are something more than the sum of all these things. That's why I invited here Paul Brooks, which is a neuropsychologist. And he's here to travel with us into the brain. He published many books, he did many films and documentary, but the thing that I like the most about him is that every time he talks about the brain, like putting this gray matter, slimy matter on the table, his voice is still human. It's very emotional, and I hope will touch you. But before to leave you to them, because who am I to tell you who are you, or to ask you who are you? Huh? Because before I leave you to them, I would like just to say a poem. A poem of Ko Un, is a Korean poet that will be here on Sunday. And I think there is a lot about tonight in that poem. It says, someone goes up on a mountain at dusk and look at the mountain's range around and asks, who are you? And all that he gets is, who are you? 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 And eventually, the question and the answer that should be made, they disappear together. And what is left is only the sunset. I would like to introduce you to Holly and Emma. I'm very happy you're here. Enjoy yourself.
Emma and Holly walks outside. Her eyes are big like bathtubs, and she stares at the day.
Emma, so sweet.
Statue of Buster Keaton. How long have you been standing there?
Enter Basset Hound.
Holly, I don't know what I'm doing.
Emma, we've been friends long enough. I promise to wait. Friendship is future-orientated.
Later that day.
Emma, a pantomime goat is what this writing is like. It comes together bleatingly, awkward at the join.
Holly, I like animals.
Emma, I like food.
Holly, I liked the mini-series about a doctor.
Basset Hound.
I lack a place to sit myself down.
Emma, a pantomime goat is what this friendship is like. It comes together bleatingly, awkward at the join. Modesty forbids me to speculate which end of the animal is mine.
Holly, I can't think without you standing there.
Emma, you're free to leave at any time.
This space between us is called politics. We write to be sociable. We say it to be sociable. In our sociability, we are testing the structures of freedom, history, and myth, the state and the subject, nature and culture. Our friendship is the best of my ethics and the most biologically possible political I am at any point. It's the only thing I can't talk about. Holly, isn't it good, the dog?
Emma, I made this.
Holly, except you haven't. You turned around and made this.
Emma, this revolting thing.
Holly, bikini, bread, bin.
Emma, not polluting.
Holly, excellent technology.
Emma, circulation.
Holly, metabolism.
Emma, bin, bread, bikini.
Basset hound.
I am conscious of my rights and freedoms. Turning around to see if you're there.
Holly, I breaded a bikini bin.
Emma, all hands together.
Holly, making something over.
Emma, other.
Holly, oven.
Emma, put it in the oven.
Holly, melt jam on it.
Emma, like-mindedness.
Basset hound.
This isn't collaboration. This is two poets, two consciousnesses, working on something together at roughly the same time. And the fact that it is not working is proof of the productivity of heterogeneity and therefore the possibility of freedom.
Holly, it's dark in the oven.
Emma, I breaded the bikini.
Holly, good invention. We cannot, we can.
Fight, we cannot, we can.
Study, we cannot, we can.
Mould, we cannot, we can.
Carve,
meal,
roll out.
Paint,
mean,
excellent.
moth,
eat,
poetry,
cinema,
loom.
We've made a statue.
Statue of Buster Keaton. I prefer the dog.
When we work on something together, our hands are the site of consciousness. We are redefined by the object we have made. It becomes the production of our consciousness, standing back and looking at the things in her hands.
A bikini, a loaf of bread.
It's a scene that I'm not in, and I remember the limits of my freedom.
I hold the bin. Because she is different to me, I know I am different and capable of thinking outside myself. She is very different. We share jokes, clothes, and metabolisms. She is the smallest possible increase and the slightest divergence away from me. It means difference and another is possible. A familial category, a group, and a species. She is publicly similar. With this basset hound as my kin, my thinking increases. Stroking the dog brings me closer to genies.
Basset hound.
You still say she.
Female friendships do politically, historically, mean something. Basset hound.
Prepare yourselves for the future. Holly, her voice is rarefied and alien.
Emma, filmic.
Holly, metabolic.
Emma, it's a nice machine.
Holly, it's a nice machine, but I don't know what you're making. No, it's making us. Basset hound.
You did not just say that.
Metabolic,
a word for the sky.
Or our version of it.
Flying across.
With more wings than a beetle.
Emma, if I just turn my head.
Holly, you say yeah when I say...
Emma, back me. Front me. Frontal. Facing at my shoulder. If I turn to say something and the plank swings around, you duck. I thought you'd gone.
Holly, I was at the bar rehearsing ethics. Modesty forbids me to be conscious of my
beetles,
to speculate or sit down
on top of these beetles. Holly and Emma look into a mirror thing. Emma, this friendship is like a mirror thing. Like Hegel's reciprocal recognition. As in, recognition cannot be unilaterally given. In the moment I give it, I am potentially given it, and the form in which I offer it is potentially given to me. I must somehow see that the other is like me, and see that the other is making the same recognition of our likeness.
Holly. Sometimes I still get nervous when we speak. I am such a nervous friend. I'm blushing now.
Emma. There is lots of light in this room, and the mirrors are peculiarly windows as well. There is transparency and illumination, things that are big, things that are romantic and theoretical, and I'm blushing.
Statue of Buster Keaton quoting Judith Butler.
This view of recognition does not encounter an exteriority that resists a bad infinity of recursive mimesis. We might consider a reading of the scene of recognition in which precisely my own opacity to myself occasions my capacity to confer a certain kind of recognition on others. It's an ethics based on our shared, invariable, and partial blindness about ourselves.
Holly and Emma together. Oh, I know who you are now. Statue of Buster Keaton.
At this moment, I cease to address you or to be addressed by you. Why is this productive?
Why is this productive?
Our dialogue.
Our dialogue.
Is it a dialogue?
Our presence.
Are we present?
We are visible.
Our proximity, then.
Are we visible to each other?
Are we visible to ourselves?
Yes and no.
I can see you.
Can I speak?
You can speak, and I can look into your mouth.
Sometimes.
Is it two-way?
Your presence.
Am I present?
You are visible.
Your flexibility, then.
Am I visible to yourselves?
No and no.
You can see us.
Can we speak?
I can speak and you can
look
into my mouth.
Sideways. My presence.
I am visibly your proximity, then.
Are you visible to each other?
Are you visible to myself? You, yes.
And possibly.
You can see
Can
me.
You speak?
We can speak and they can
look
into our mouths.
Always. Why is it productive?
Why
our dialogue?
Productive?
Is it a dialogue? Are we seen to each other? Our presence? Are we now?
Are we now?
Our proximity? About us visible to ourselves? Yes and no. I can see you.
Yes and no.
I can. Can I speak? You can talk and I can look into your mouth cavity occasionally. Is there a presence? Is there a dialogue? Am I present? You are visible, your location, and then I am, you can see us, and I can talk. Can we talk? I can talk, and you can look at my mouth laterally, naturally. My presence, I am obviously, you close, and then are you visible to each other? Are you visible to myself? Yes, and optimally, you can see me. Can you speak? We can talk and they can look through each other's eye holes. In this,
we are writing ourselves. Me, you, me, in as voices and as figures, Emma and Holly.
Holly and her friend. Emma and her friend, Holly. Those two names are present in the way Buster Keaton is in that poem. I mean, that space, that weird white space.
A dull grey sky, opaque like paper, the off-white paper showing through the gaps in a photocopy. An old silent sky, so flattened and yes, sexless. Animated only by a momentary flight of a sexless animal, a circus animal, e.g. a goat risen on hind parts as if boxing.
But only once.
Two and more animals and things that fell out of our eyes, the bathtubs.
This landscape is like a film, I mean strangely flat. But cinematic, i.e. things can pass through, as if from one side of the frame to another, appear and then go. The way it goes suggests the camera is following something, seeing through its eyes. We are looking, deadpan, the way things pass through and then are gone.
I loved it in the video we saw the other week, that luxury carpet, exactly the same colour as the sweater, when the camera swooped through the leaves down onto the sweater's neckline and got so close we could see the fibre. So trivial, so touchable.
There was a scratching sound in the speakers, fuzzing and a burrowing with the lens.
The sweater looked new, so it was plausible.
And then passing through it into the dark, a close-up, seeing fibres or skin cells or pixels or pen marks.
Like the bullet going through the hide of a deer.
Sound effect like... Then a sense of everything floating around, all around, even above, in the dark, in a bath, floating, developing, and being dragged backwards, through a hedge backwards, out into the open. Is that the sky again, or merely the glare off the surface of a photograph?
Opacity is important to this.
Pause.
Holly, how well it all turned out. Emma, swinging the bucket around possibly on one finger.
Emma, there are sticks alike everywhere. In each garden we pass through, sticks ready to be taken and bent at implausible angles. We could do it just for show. How would it be for there to be two protagonists who are seeing through one another's eyes and narrating one another's positions?
Being present to one another's opacity, to herself.
Itself.
Just as sometimes I am the audience. In your head.
My hands look different this way round.
I'll get the spare key.
Herself.
Competitive silence.
The water won't come out.
The neck is channel.
What is impossible to narrate? The exposure that is constitutive.
In your developing bath.
You're developing, I'm developing in a bath.
And what is possible?
I'm changing!
The heck?
Pause. The whole sky falls down as water.
Deadpan. Silence.
Wet paper.
As in dead from dead, and pan from face. Dead pan. As in you can't see your own face, what it is doing, how empty and innocent and shrill and pert it is.
Emma. Okay, here's a plan. You fall in the pond and I'll call for help.
I'm a poet, so I'm going to be reading a few poems, and then I may or may not read some prose that I wrote for tonight, answering some of the questions that have been posed, but I guess we shall see. But the first poem I'm going to read is called Boobs Are Real. And I just want to say it's a very old poem. Boobs are real. They stole my tires, they knocked down my house, they killed my father, they cut off my fingers. And I thought, and I did like those fingers. They pierced my eyelids, they scalped my brain, they ran their sweaty fingers down my sweaty back. They played me music, but it wasn't music. They loved me, and then they didn't. Somewhere in there I grew these enormous boobs. At some point what they took away was given back in the form of boobs. What they took from me, they gave back, just like, as Lydia Davis says, when a limit has been reached, what is real but does not help is lost forever and replaced by the unreal. The difference is, these boobs are real. Like I said, it's an old poem. Things were different 10 years ago in terms of gravity, and it's just hasn't been the same since 10 years ago, maybe. But the next poem I want to read is called I Like Weird Ass Hippies. Definitely dedicated to Alex. I like weird ass hippies. I like weird ass hippies and men with hairy backs and small green animals and organic milk and chickens that hatch out of farms in Vermont. I like weird ass stuff. When we reach the other world, we will all be hippies. I like your weird ass spirit stick that you carry around. I like when you rub sage on my door. I like the lamb's blood you throw on my face. I like heaping sugar in a jar and saying a prayer and then having it work. I like cursing out an enemy and then cursing them in objects, soaking their baby tooth in oil, lighting it on fire with a tiny plastic horse. I like running through the fields of green. I am so caught up in flowers and fruit. I like shampooing my body in strange potions you bought wholesale in Guatemala. I like when you rub your patchouli on me and tell me I'm a man. I am a fucking man, a weird-ass fucking man. If I didn't know any better, I'd think I were Jesus or something. If I didn't know any better, I'd sail to ancient Greece, wear sandals, then go to Rome, murder my daughter in front of the gods, smoke powdered lapis, carve pictographs into your dress, 1,000 miles away from anything. When I die, I will be a strange fucking hippie, and so will you, so get your cut-up heart away from what you think you know. You know we are all going away from here. At least have some human patience for what lies on the other side. And this next poem is called What Poets Should Do. Poets should get back to saying crazy shit all of the time. I am sick of academics or business people telling poets what we should do. A poet is a scientist to favor poetry or science, in that both relate to Buddhism. However, both are things that melt. A purple haze or dawn, what sunken in, always a shifting mood. But it's true, I love you guys and gals of the wood and word. Let's say whatever it is we please. We don't have to defend anything. It is our God-given right to declaim. No, let me start again. It is our universal law to speak, not an actuary to measure how thin the arguments of our verse. To say we make a treatise in language, no. No, we go on living and living and living on. That's beautiful. And poems are too. Poems and shells, these little nothings, I pick them up all the livelong day. They are the signposts of comfort possible, to smooth the jagged edges of this worried traveler. That's what poems should do, and that's what poets actually do. Damn light, always going in on my face. I just want a poem to speak of, so I go on and on into the night, and the townspeople, they say to you that they may have seen a monster, but no, no, I was only the dawn. And I've been watching a lot of Freddy Krueger movies lately. Do you guys like Nightmare on Elm Street? Okay. Well, here's a poem to Freddy, and it's called Me and You. You know that scene in an old Freddy movie where there's that junkie? She's kind of a punk and seems tough, but with that mere surface level punk vulnerability. She's wearing all silver and black. They are in an She says, "Fuck you, Freddie," and brandishes a knife. He looks at her alarmed, then lifts his arms. "Wanna get high," he says, each finger a syringe filled with bright blue. On her arms, little pockets and mouths, open, beckoning. What does he do? He falls forward with intent, and she knows what she's in for. Who is that? That's me and you. Who is that? That's me and you. And now I think I'm going to read this prose piece that I wrote for tonight, answering some of the questions that, we're discussing. And it'll only take like 25 to 40 minutes. I was told that was okay. Is that fine? Or I'm kidding. Just okay. It makes just kidding. But it's called Science Poetry. It won't take that long. Only 32 minutes. No. It's called Science Poetry, the Imagination, the I, the you, and the we. I ask myself this question a lot. Without the imagination, what are we? What is the imagination, and is it a shared space where we can all go alone and or together? And how is the imagination about the I and the we, and how is this a form of science? Maxine Greene, the famous imagination theorist, says of the social imagination, "Our very realization that the individual does not perceive community may summon up images of relation, of the networks of concern in which we teachers still do our work, and as we do so, create and recreate ourselves. More and more of us, for all our postmodern preoccupations, are aware of how necessary it is to keep such visions of possibility before our eyes in the face of rampant carelessness and alteration and fragmentation. As I write this, a child is crying, and he feels what I feel. Long ago, I wanted to be a scientist, but for what? Possibly for the prestige, not this kind of kindness that Maxine Greene speaks about. When a child cries relentlessly, as it does now, and it is not my child, the cries, they sound like melting. The sound crying into itself, that's poetry, melting into the air. But today when I think about the feelings that I have regarding science and poetry, I can't help but think of the fact that I was recently asked to write a short piece of what could be considered an insect poetics. I am not sure that my friend that asked me had a goal for a call of this topic, but for me, insect poetics became the erotic sum that forces the social into a tight I-we relationship, where the I is always in context with the you. For him, I wrote about how when I was little, I was weird, and I didn't have many friends, and I made friends with the worms and the flies that I would find outside in the dirt. And then how in college, because I wanted so much to be a scientist, for prestige or for what, I worked in a neurobiology laboratory and dissected flies in order to study their brains and how their behaviors related to the patterns in their brains. So in effect, I murdered my friends for the sake of science. What poetry! I did it all because to be a scientist is to be better than a poet, or at least I thought so. Or at least I thought you thought so. Or at least I thought we thought so. The dream of being a scientist, of being a person in a lab is deeper. Is not the science lab the most viable poetry community? Also, when I think about science and poetry and the intersections therein, and I think about how the I becomes the you, becomes the two together, the we, I, and all of the other stuff, and I really start to think about rhetoric, my first thought goes to Sylvia Plath's poem, The Hanging Man. And as she writes, "By the roots of my hair some god got hold of me. I sizzled in his blue volts like a desert prophet. The night snapped out of sight like a lizard's eyelid, a world of bald white days in a shadeless socket. A vulturous boredom pinned me in this tree. If he were I, he would do what I did." After all, although the reference to the tarot card, the Hanging Man, might suggest Plath's connection to the mystical sciences, to the inversion and relation of herself to, and this figure, the Hanged Man, as he is actually called, Not a martyr, as many people take the card to mean, but instead a person who logically acts resigned in the face of despair. In the poem, Plath uses very logical language to admit to something very magical. Every line is either an if-then construction or a statement about reality. Her language is vehemently matter-of-fact, with each line speaking a kind of truth. But of course there is nothing real in the poem. Perhaps this is a way science and poetry can intersect, the language and rhetoric of science, which is clear and plain enough to make the real real, and the very stuff of poetry which is made to make the imagination real. No, I think I wanted to be a scientist because I loved something about the inquiry. There was not the idea of being a doctor and helping people, although there was some of that, but more that when you enact with the process of thinking and meditating on something deeply, that you engage in a social community of thinkers, that you use a space between the I and the we. Isn't the inquiry what some of us love about certain types of poetry? No, it is more my imagination locked in pain, and I can't see my way out of it. So I do and do not respond to the cry of children, to the cry of humankind. Doom love all of it, for the sake of the we or of the she. You know it's just plainly true, the doom of love, that is the very best kind. Thank you very much.
Bonsoir, good evening. I'm afraid I have some slides to show. I met Dorothea for the first time about an hour ago, and the first question she put to me was, do you like science? Which made me feel very threatened. So I'm going to try and justify my love of science, actually, but also my belief that it has significant limitations when it comes to talking about the self and the human condition. My background is in clinical neuropsychology. I don't do that these days very much. But one of the things that always interested me was in neuroscience, neuropsychology, we know quite a bit about how different subsystems of the brain operate, how the brain performs functions involved with language, with different aspects of perception, with memory, with the control of action and so forth. But until quite recently, there was not very much interest in how this all comes together to produce a unified sense of self. And it seemed to me, working with patients with sometimes quite severe brain damage, their sense of self and their presentation of self to other people was quite radically changed. Over the last 10 years or so, I've had the privilege of working with a visual artist called Susan Aldworth. And about 12 years ago, Susan had a suspected brain hemorrhage and underwent various neurological investigations, including an angiogram. And she was lying in the angiography suite, looking up at real-time images of the inside of her head. And ever since then, she's had a deep fascination with questions about consciousness and selfhood. And this is what she wrote: you're looking inside your head whilst thinking, seeing, feeling. And I will never make sense of that moment, a crisis of identity. Where is the me in all this? I still cannot escape the thought that I am seeing all this and thinking all this because of the very thing I am looking at. The brain is a strange and marvellous thing. Although it's flesh, it's not like a heart or a kidney or a bowel, it's thinking flesh. I cannot get a hold on consciousness. How can the physical be mental? I am my brain, and I am other than my brain. And I think with those words, she cuts right through to the heart of the problem. But I think, in fact, there are two problems. One is the problem of consciousness. How is it possible, how is it conceivable that the meat of the brain can become mind? How does meat become mind? This is a classical problem in philosophy known as the mind-body problem, or the matter-consciousness problem. And then we have another problem, which is, I think, rather more tractable as a scientific question. That's the problem of selfhood. So what I want to do is to go through some ideas about both the nature of consciousness and the nature of selfhood, and then discuss a couple of neurological patients whose cases I think throw light on these questions. So the problem of selfhood, one of the key problems is what is it that gives us unity and what is it that gives us continuity? What makes us the same from one day to the next across a lifetime, if anything? So this is me. So top left, this is me as a 5-year-old, I think 5-year-old. Top middle is me as about a 9-year-old in my favourite football team's kit. Top right, that's me about 14. Bottom left, that's me around about 20 when I was a revolutionary socialist. Bottom middle, that's me when I'm working for an American multinational corporation in New York. That's me in my 40s, and here I am now turned 60. The question is, what, if anything, persists over time? I can point to the picture top left, so that's me, but clearly it's not me, it's a 5-year-old. My tastes, my interests, my motivations, my knowledge are radically different from that little boy's interests and tastes and motivations and so forth. What remains the same? Physically, all we have in common is we were built from the same genetic instructions. We have similarities in biography, in history. We had the same mother. In fact, we had the same birth. We were registered with the same name and so forth. But as time goes by, every molecule in that little boy's body has been replaced. So by the time he's 9 or 10, he's a completely different physical entity, and so on, all the way through. Now, historically, there have been, broadly speaking, two general theories of what selves are. The ego theory and the bundle theory. Now, the ego theory, sometimes called the soul theory, is the kind of intuitive, common sense view of what we are. We tend to think that we are a unitary, continuous being with the same thing from one day to the next. We are sort of a Cartesian I, an experiencer of experiences. And that constitutes the essential core of every person, and that's what persists over time. Now, the alternative is bundle theory. This goes back to the Buddha and has its modern formulation in the work of David Hume in the 18th century. And bundle theory rejects this idea that there's any kind of essential ego or I or soul. All there are sequences of interconnected mental events, thoughts, perceptions, emotions, etc. And each life is a long series or bundle of enmeshed, causally related mental states, but there's nothing at the center. And there's no deeper fact about being a person than that psychological continuity, sometimes called the memory theory of personal identity. Now, what I want to do now is a thought experiment to see whether which of you would put yourself into the bundle theory category and which of you would consider yourselves to be ego theorists. And it's a thought experiment devised by a philosopher called Derek Parfit, who stole the idea from Star Trek, basically. It's about teleportation. And then I stole the idea from Derek Parfit and wrote a story about it. But I'm just going to give you the gist of the idea. So you have to imagine we're in some future date and you're making regular trips to Mars. And you normally go by spacecraft and it takes months and months to get there. And then someone invents a teleportation machine. And you have the option to get there at the speed of light, so it just takes a few minutes. This is how it works. You walk into a special booth, slightly reluctantly. You press a big red button, and you are vaporized. Okay? In the process, there's a special scanner that reads the state of every cell in your body. The information is then digitally encoded and sent by radio transmission to Mars, where? There we go. You are reconstructed cell by cell from locally available material. And then you walk out and go about your business with your memories, your personality perfectly intact, because the patterns of brain function are precisely as they were when you walked into the transmission booth in the bottom there. So, would anybody object to this process? Who would voluntarily Let me just reassure that it's absolutely perfectly safe, by the way. It's much safer than space travel or travel by aircraft. So, hands up those people who would do this, who would consent to be teleported in this way. I don't believe it. One, okay. And is it just one? 2, 3, 4, 5, okay. So you people can consider yourselves bundle theorists. Welcome to the Bundle Club. Because what you believe is that all that matters about being a person is the pattern of mental activity and the continuity. So, I'll try and remember who those people were. There is a sterner test, though, and that's this. You step into the booth. This process never fails. You're vaporized. The information is sent to Mars, but something goes wrong, and you're reconstituted back on Earth. However, it's too late to pull the information back, so you are duplicated. Now, those people who said they would be happy to do this, I'm not going to get you to give the answer, but have a think about which one you would prefer to be. Okay? And does it make a difference? And if you say, I'd rather be the one who went into the booth on Earth and got reconstituted on Earth, because that's close to what I really am, what if I tell you that as a result of the process, you've got a fatal heart condition, you'll be dead within 3 days? Now, which one would you rather be? Okay, we're going to move away from fantasy, because I think the reality of brain disorder produces some effects on selfhood which actually cut across these classical philosophical distinctions in such a way that egos are actually bundles. And I'm going to talk about 2 types of case. Before I do that, let me just say a little bit about the distinction that's being made by philosophers and neuroscientists in recent years. They distinguish between the core self, or the minimal self, which is the self of the present moment, closest to this sort of Cartesian idea of the experience of experiences, the author of actions, and then they talk about the narrative self or the extended self. So this is what we think about when we think about personal identity. So as a coherent, continuous being journeying from the past to future, self as object rather than subject. The question for a neuropsychologist is, can we dissociate the minimal self and the extended self? In other words, are there some forms of brain disorder which will affect one and not the other? And I want to tell you about, a few years ago I had the privilege of working with a jazz musician called Pat Martino, and we made a documentary film about him. Pat is one of the truly most extraordinary people I've ever met. He has a most remarkable story. He grew up in Philadelphia. He was an absolute prodigy on the guitar. He made a string of successful albums in the 1960s, and then he developed a serious mental illness, and he was diagnosed as manic depressive, what we now call bipolar disorder. And then he started to develop seizures, epileptic seizures, and had a near-fatal brain hemorrhage, because what he actually had was a brain disorder called an arteriovenous malformation, which is an abnormal collection of blood vessels, and it started to bleed. So at the age of 36, he had a left temporal lobectomy, so the left temporal lobe was, at least about 70% of it was completely removed. And it saved his life, but it wiped his memory. So he had a complete loss of identity, apparently no knowledge of the guitar, hated his own, didn't realize who he was, didn't recognize his parents. His father would play his own records at high volume and he hated it, couldn't identify with it at all. And then after years of silence and drifting around, he took up the guitar again and developed technique, studying technique from a collection of tuition videos from a great teacher, his former self. Now, Pat, as well as being a remarkable case of loss of identity, now stresses that he lives entirely in the moment. So this would be a case of someone who has damage to the extended self, but the in-the-moment self, the core self, still seems to be intact. There are lots of other interesting things about the way he looks at his life history, which I won't have time to talk about now, but if you have any questions when we get to the discussion later, then I'd be happy to talk about that. So that's the problem with the extended self. I want to talk a little bit about Cotard's syndrome, which I would argue is a dissolution of the minimal self. In other words, the Cartesian I disappears, but autobiography remains intact. Cotard's named after Jules Cotard, who was a French psychiatrist working in the late 19th century, and he identified a series of cases with interesting self-negating delusions. So they would believe that parts of their body had disappeared or were rotting away, or in extreme cases that they were actually dead, they didn't exist at all. So a couple of cases. This is a man I had some clinical involvement with, 53 years old. Philip, we called him. Presented with a kind of a dementia, typical sort of cognitive decline, memory problems, and then started to develop signs of Cotard's syndrome. And they came through very gradually. So he would say, what happens if somebody dies on the ward? What's the procedure for removing a body? So he's got very interesting questions about death. And then he said, well, do you think I'm still alive? And we had these sort of quite long Socratic debates about whether this man was actually alive. Turned out he had a condition called Hashimoto's encephalopathy, which was treatable, so he's, as far as I know, he's now more or less fully recovered. There's another case that I had some dealings with a few years ago. This man tried to commit suicide by electrocution and believed that he had succeeded. And he went to see his general practitioner and said, I've come to prove that I'm dead. What's interesting about this guy is that he went on to have he was the first patient to have any PET scanning, positron emission tomography. And it was extraordinarily interesting what came out of it. And this is a quote from the guy who actually did the scans. He said, I've been studying PET scans for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone who was on his feet, who was interacting with people, with such an abnormal scan result. Graham's brain function resembles that of someone during anesthesia or sleep. Seeing this pattern in someone who is awake is quite unique to my knowledge. So this was a man who claimed not to be having any experiences, and yet was able to sit and have a conversation and tell you about his life and his career. So what I'm suggesting is that here we have a stripping away of the minimal self, the self of the present moment, the experiencer. He's as close to a neurological zombie or a philosophical zombie as we're likely to get, I think. I suddenly remembered that a very good American poet called Sarah Smitches Martin, I don't know if you know her work, but I wrote about one of these cases, and she wrote a poem about it. And I suddenly remembered, and then about 10 minutes, well, half an hour ago, she sent me the poem. And if I can find it on the email, I'd like to read it to you. Okay, so she wrote this poem called Cotard Syndrome. And I've never read this before, so forgive me if I stumble a bit. The first two lines are taken from the paper or the chapter that I wrote about this case, a woman called Jeannie. Jeannie was well oriented for time, place, and person. As for being dead or alive, she was all at sea. She sits in her usual chair, her lips dry as dust. She's aware of her tongue limp between her teeth. She swallows water, feels it slosh inside her chest. Her organs, she says, sag out of place. The rest of her charting the ghostly feed. In time, her mouth will close into a scar. She won't believe she has a face to speak out of. She senses death waiting, a driver with a sign at the airport. She's inside the terminal somewhere, counting backwards. So I said I thought there were limitations to science, and I absolutely think there are severe limitations to science when it comes to understanding human beings. And I think the novelist David Lodge has said some quite interesting things. It's a very worthwhile book. He refers to what he calls the dense specificity of personal experience. He says that works of literature, in contradistinction to science, describe the dense specificity of personal experience. Science, from its objective third-person perspective, tries to formulate universally applicable, general explanations. The subjective and the unique are anathema to science. And he suggests that lyric poetry is arguably man's most successful effort to describe qualia. Qualia are the technical term for the sort of raw feels of experience. And he suggests the novel is arguably man's most successful effort to describe the experience of individual human beings moving through space and time. And I think what he's done there is very neatly describe the attributes of the core self and the narrative self. So we can look at the core self and the narrative self in sort of the neurological way that I've suggested, but they find expression in these different forms of literature. I'd like to round off, if I just have time, to read a couple of things from my new book, which will be out next year. Two short pieces extracted from different chapters. And one is, it's my slightly tongue-in-cheek, slightly, not jokey, but I'm serious about this, attempt to challenge a materialist, functionalist view of consciousness. And by that, I just mean the idea that all that consciousness is very complex patterns of firing amongst billions and billions of neurons in the brain. And that's all you require to produce consciousness, the whole range of consciousness, perception, emotion, and so on. And my argument, and I've put this argument to many very eminent philosophers, and no one has come back yet with a counter-argument. And I'm suggesting that there must be many instances in nature where you get patterns which replicate the patterns of neuronal firing in the brain. And what I'm suggesting here is that a forest might quite literally experience flashes of consciousness. I'm not saying I believe this, I'm just putting it forward as a slightly cheeky idea. It's called Tiger, Tiger, and it's with apologies and acknowledgement, obviously, to William Blake. Picture a great forest. Let's say it's the dead of night. A storm is raging. At the heart of a forest, the brawny oak sways and shakes in the howling wind. Resplendent with a million leaves, invisible in the dark, its branches whip this way and that, clashing with the boughs of neighbouring trees. Oak, sycamore, beech and alder bustle shoulder to shoulder. Billions of raindrops are bombarding millions of shuddering leaves. Rainwater drips and trickles through the canopy, cascading down to the protected understory of saplings and shrubs, dogwood and holly, into the undergrowth where ants and beetles scurry down into the earth. All is action and connection, countless drops of water, countless twigs and leaves in constant, fleeting interaction. Gusts and zephyrs of wind shaping large and small-scale patterns of association and energy flow. Picture yourself sheltering under the oak tree in the dark. And then, from nowhere, flashes the image of a tiger. It's visible for 2 or 3 seconds, but not to you. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night. All you see are black shadows and glimpses of gloomy cloud over the crown of the tree from time to time. The rain stops, the wind subsides, the forest is still. You can have moonlight if you want, but there's no sign of a tiger. Why would there be in an English forest? And finally, a short piece. People often say to me, you think you're a soulless machine. And I say, yeah, I'm quite happy with that. That's fine. I can live with that. How can you interact with people if you think they're soulless machines? Well, I'm happy with that too. And this is a very end of a chapter, and it's just a paragraph I wrote about my granddaughter when she was 3 years old. And we played a little game. I played a game with my 3-year-old granddaughter. I got her to cover her eyes with her hands, and I asked some questions. Now, Millie, can I see you? Can I see your feet? Yes. Can I see your tummy? Yes. Can I see your hands? Yes. Can I see you? No. And of course I never will. There's nothing to see. Behind the laughing eyes, behind the silky hair, the bony box of her cranium contains nothing but a few 100 grams of jellified fats, proteins, sugars and salts. A brain. She's biological machinery all the way through. There are no spirits coursing through her brain circuits, just neurochemicals. Does this devalue her? No, quite the opposite. On the scale of human history, she's more transient and fragile than a soap bubble. No part of her ebullient consciousness will survive her death, and no memory of her will survive mine. It's a hard thought to grasp, but the truth. And the improbable gift of conscious selfhood is to be treasured all the more for its transience.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm very happy about tonight. And I have many questions. So many. I mostly have 8 pages of questions. So maybe before I start to ask questions, maybe if you have questions to ask to each other, or maybe you have questions. Yes?
Well, I loved how organically I felt like everybody's things flowed into each other. I know it behooves me to say that, but it felt as if things were kind of like circling around similar topics which you prompted. But I love kind of watching that lineage happen in a good way.
Thank you.
It was extremely well curated.
Thank you. Yes.
Questions?
There are any questions from the audience, otherwise?
Sorry to ask this, what may be a naive question, but do you guys do a lot of collaborations together?
I don't think this is... Oh, no, that's working, isn't it? Yes. We probably work more individually than together, but we have started in the last few years doing a semi-regular sort of collaboration in performance.
Yeah. We avoided it for a really long time, even though it was really obvious. But Emma and I have been friends since birth. We have a kind of a really long history going back. Our fathers were best friends and were children together at school. Not at school, but as very young children. I thought they were at school. Yeah, fathers at school. And then our mothers became friends when they were pregnant, and they all hung out and got drunk together. And I think my dad is my dad and your dad is your dad, but there could be some confusion over there. So we've got a very long history together, and of growing up and being as teenagers together. So we avoided trying to do collaboration together for a really long time, even though when we finally did, it was just the most obvious, natural kind of thing to do with our practices. Yeah.
And actually somebody paired us up without knowing we knew each other, who said, oh, you should really meet this person, you'd really get on. And so, yeah.
And you feel that the whole is greater than some of the parts? Do you feel that could you write individually as well?
Yes. Yes, we both work individually, and I think we were really worried that the whole would be less than the two parts. And I'm not sure whether it's more, it's just different, other, probably a little bit stranger.
Mm-hmm.
If I can pick up the ball now in this conversation, I would like just to talk about this telephone call. Because I think it's really interesting, this idea that somehow I think in the paper that you presented for this Voices of Urgency here, you were talking about this telephone call that you may have with a friend or with a lover. And I don't know if I understood it well, but what I understood is that you are on the telephone with someone else, right? And you are experiencing something completely different. Maybe it's night here and it's day down there, maybe I'm just in the countryside and you're in the city, right? But then something happens and it's like we are somewhere else as well. Especially without, like on Skype, I always prefer not to use the camera, see? Because then you create, maybe I would like to say that you create another self that is somewhere else, right? Somewhere else, in this between, in kind of a dark space or imaginary space. And then what I liked about the text that you sent, but maybe it was just my interpretation, is that at some moment you said, but once we are on the telephone, who is going to hang up? Once this new entity is created, it can be very difficult. I'm saying this because I remember when I was a teenager and having this girlfriend, and we was always like, are you there? Yes, I'm here. And now, yes, I'm here. And then we were like, don't hang up, right? Or you killed this third self.
Yes. Yeah, I quite like how that's also, it's a kind of like it's literally electric, you know? So you actually, your voice becomes an electrically reproduced thing in the other person's ear, and what's in between you is electric. And I kind of feel like that's like, the channel's open, there's a kind of buzz there, you know? The kind of, you know, we're on. And there's also the kind of threat of interference or feedback or it being cut off. So there's something about the telephone line that's a little bit heightened, and it makes you, it puts everything up a notch in terms of it being a conversation. I don't know, it's like you kind of...
I was going to say, does it also distance you from yourself
yes.
in a way, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So you don't see the body language.
Yeah.
So it's kind of it's a segment of a conversation, but it's not the whole picture.
If someone with Cotard syndrome, if they're on the phone to a family member, they believe it's them, but when they see them, it's not. They don't believe it's
that's
them.
Capgras. Capgras syndrome. That's a different. It's also a delusion of identification, but a different sort. That's where you think that it's usually a loved one you think is an imposter or a zombie, and the explanation for that. One of the explanations is that ordinarily when we see someone very close to us, as well as the sort of the basic visual image and the sounds and so forth, we get an emotional charge. So if there's a disconnection between the emotional circuits in the brain and the perceptual circuits. Whereas if it's over the phone, it's on a different scale and you don't have, there's not the same kind of competition.
All feel that there's some space which is equivalent to a phone call, that's like a shared kind of imaginative space that people enter, and it has like an electrical buzz, like you're saying, where people have kind of shared something and become this other entity?
I think poetry is like that.
Yeah, I would
would agree. For all the reasons you just said, yeah.
Do you think other art forms are? Or?
Well, I guess kind of working with you in performance is like, it feels like the phone calls that we have, it feels like the phone calls are rehearsal for those moments, and those moments are rehearsals for our phone calls and that kind of thing.
There was a psychologist called Julian Jaynes, which some of you will have heard of, and he had a theory which was that human beings weren't fully self-conscious until about the 3rd millennium BC. Okay, and before then, and if you look at the Iliad, when big decisions have to be taken, it's the gods who come in and take the decision. Now, James's theory has been criticised in many ways, but I think there's an interesting germ of truth about it. And he was suggesting that poetry is a relic of that ancient form of mind. So it's coming from elsewhere, even though from within. And I think there's an element of that. I mean, he also argued that some forms of psychosis were the same thing as well. But there is a sense of dissociation in poetry where, I mean, it's well documented. A lot of the best stuff comes from nowhere. It's like if you think about it too hard, then you can think once it's come through, you can polish it. But the essence of the idea seems to come from nowhere. And James's idea was that it comes from the right hemisphere of the brain. That's where it comes from.
Yeah. That's really interesting because I talk to myself a lot, like kind of out loud in public, and quite often these little rambling chats I have with myself turn into kind of composition, and it turns into poetry, and that kind of like harks back to these kind of voices in your head as kind of receiving messages of truth from another place, but now it's just this kind of creative kind of engagement with my own consciousness on some level.
I think that's right. I think there's a dissociation, a detachment from our self of the present moment and 100 different voices that go on all the time. And they kind of filter through in a way, and they're kind of edited as they come through. And, I will think things that my editor says, no, you can't possibly say that. But there are 10 things that compete at the same time. And that's kind of natural and normal. People with Tourette's syndrome don't edit in the same way, and things come through.
This is interesting. This Julian Jaynes is the breakdown of the bicameral mind. Yeah, and I have a question for you. It's related to that book probably, and is: do you think that we are still hallucinating? Because in that book, it's like people were like hearing the right part of the brain talking to the motorial special part, giving orders.
Well, they were less unitary beings than we are, he would argue, okay, less unitary. But, I mean, we've had this sort of conversation over lunch, which is...
About hallucination.
I think the whole world's a hallucination, which is not to say that it doesn't exist, but it's... the pathways in the brain that produce, for example, visual imagery are precisely the pathways that are involved in the perception of the real world out there. So, and there's nothing that we see that isn't a construction. And there's a lovely book by Italo Calvino called Mr. Palomar. And Mr. Palomar is swimming in the sea. The sun's going down, and he suddenly realizes that there's this blade of light that comes from the sun, and it's pointing directly at him, and he feels very special. And then he thinks, well, everybody else in the sea is seeing the same thing. And then he thinks, well, what happens if we all get out of the sea, go back onto the beach? There is no blade of the sun. And that, for me, absolutely captures the essence of this idea that the world, and as he puts it, he's swimming in his mind. And I think we're swimming and walking in our own minds all the time.
It's interesting because tomorrow we will have here Marcus Gabriel, who is a philosopher, and he has a complete different approach than yours. And I really would like, looking forward for you to meet together, because
me too,
I think it can be like, wow. And I have another question for Dorothy and Ollie and Emma. And it's when in a poem, a poet writes the word you. Because I always, when I read, for example, Walt Whitman, and there is this you coming out, it's like, fuck, he's talking to me. It's like, I'm not going to walk anywhere without your hands in mine, you know? And it's like, wow, my hand is talking to me, you know, you're talking to me. I know that you write poems in which this you is sometimes addressed to a specific person, and sometimes to fictional ones. But I would like to know what it means for you to write you on a poem.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about the idea of an I as a shapeshifter, and an I that's always putting on different costumes and sort of changing, and you know, when you think you understand what that I is, the I is going to morph into something else. And so I think of the you kind of in a similar way. There may be some shreds of consistency, but it really is this immortal, beloved you, which is definitely the reader. But of course that is changeable because readers are always changing, but there's some sort of sense of that kind of palpable relationship or palpable conversation, sort of like the idea of a phone call and the electrical buzz and stuff.
It's interesting, but it's also risky, because me, sometimes when I perform, I always say you. Like today, I was like,
yeah, you.
Who are you, right? And people, they take it personally, and somehow it is, and somehow it is not. And what is your position?
Well, I was thinking of something slightly different, but maybe it will kind of segue in. I mean, I don't really write things for the page. I just write things for performance. So that's different already, because there's the you that is the you of the page, the you of language, and then there's the you which is in the moment of address, which is like an act of kind of, when I say you, you are you. You know, you're being addressed. And I'm interested in the feeling of being an audience, a feeling of being an audience, in an audience, you know, like that you know that is you being addressed, but it's also not you, because it's this idea of audience, and you happen to be sitting in the place where the audience is. So it's kind of like, it is you, but it's also not you. But you kind of, I think you have a little bit of room there, and I think in the moments where those two things coincide and feels suddenly immediate or physical, it's either really sort of awkward or really funny, or both. So yes, I suppose I'm interested in the kind of the linguistic you is both kind of absolutely you and completely not your body, in just this kind of position that you're feeling. Does that make sense? I'm not sure it does.
No, it does.
But, I think that sort of relates to some of your questions.
Yeah, I think there's also a collapse between the writer and the reader. I mean, especially with the written words, because essentially what it's about, we all have a little voice, internal monologue. Essentially what writing's about is taking control of that. And people relinquish control incredibly easily. You know, I can get absolutely lost in a novel, and time goes by, I'm not aware of it. I've become that voice in the book. And I think that links back to sort of the Julian Jaynes idea that we do listen to voices, you know, we do all the time listen to voices, whether they're sort of literally voices or whether they're kind of subconscious voices. But that seems to me that's kind of the essence of certainly prose writing anyway. Yeah.
We are talking a lot about the brain, you know, but there are other things probably that create this self in somehow or some way. I was reading, for example, some some paper from biologists. And they're telling that actually we are more or less flowers of bacteria. Like there are millions of microorganisms living with us, and like also bacteria living with us, and more or less we're like this cosmopolitan.
We're a huge colony of bacteria.
Yeah, a huge colony on two legs, right? And it seems that they send messages to let us do something that is necessary for them, or things like that. So I am not sure that this self is created only with the brain. We should have a look also on the intestine.
But
see what I'm talking about.
Sure, but it's in terms of what we conventionally think of as the self, the I, is what the brain makes sense of in those terms. So there's also, you know, the I is just the kind of the crest of the wave of the self, I think. And there's a lot that goes on below the surface of the ocean. But it's how the brain makes sense of it. And, you know, we might want to have all kinds of metaphors as to what the self is. but it's how the brain makes sense of it. And I don't think the brain is sufficient for cells, but I do think it's necessary.
Yeah, it's not sufficient.
Yeah.
It's the bacteria, of course, that means that we is possible as well. I mean, it's the bacteria that means I'm not a kind of succinct colony of bacteria. It's existing kind of coming from other spaces. It comes from my dog back to me. I give it to my dog. It's this kind of collaborative process of kind of bacteriaing. Yeah. The community is founded on this kind of like gut flora as much as, and metabolism as much as kind of a politics or an ethics. So yeah, and there's this wonderful quote from Eileen Miles who says we write with our metabolisms and we write with our sexuality, and I'm really interested in kind of thinking about what else feeds into practice, you know, our hormones and our everything else that's not mind.
Here with us there is, just a second, here with us there is a Yolanda Insana. I think she's still here, or she left? I think. Oh yes, she's still here, she's down there. She's a poet, she's going to be present tomorrow. You know, a great Italian poet, and really a rare Italian voice, Italian poetry. And she wrote a beautiful poem about this. But if I can, I would like to read just one segment, just a few lines. It says, "She said she lives alone because she does not recognize as guests the 100 trillion microorganisms that are in her body. Over 1 million billion, just in the skin." I like this to say something about the bacteria part. And this is also related, of course, to I like your weird-ass hippies. I like how you bring the physicality into the poem, especially like in these boobs are real. A certain moment when you read it is different from reading it on the paper, because suddenly this body appears. Yeah. So I was thinking maybe if you can tell a little bit about this metaphysical eye.
Oh, sure, yeah. It started because I was teaching a class in Roman poets, and I was noticing a lot of things that Roman poets did were very similar to hip-hop poets that I love, and you know, the idea of like swagger and kind of the visceral sort of crude nature of the humor in both kinds of poems. And so I came up with this idea of the metaphysical eye just because I really wanted to think about an eye that would always take on costumes and really say anything. But a quintessential person who kind of speaks in the metaphysical eye who doesn't follow either of those categories is Eileen Miles and her famous poem, An American Poem, where she does that thing. I don't know if people are familiar with that, but she has this poem and she's talking, and then she admits to being a Kennedy. And she says, you know, it's true, I am a Kennedy and all this stuff. And so she speaks from that position of authority. And when you're watching the recording, or if you're watching her read it, you have to wonder, is she a Kennedy, is she not? It's like almost enough close to the truth that she can sort of shapeshift herself. So yeah, it's something that is very, very important to me. And I feel that all great poems have some element of it.
But when we you say always that we are storytellers, or we are performed storytelling. And I think that you also said that if we can change the story, like if we can say, I am a Kennedy, if we can change the story we tell, we probably can change also some biological part of the brain. Is this a relationship between this mental that is produced by the material, and then the mental can interfere with the material?
Well...
Is this or not?
I'm a really hard-nosed materialist. I think the mental is physical, if we just talk about it in different ways. So I don't think there's an interaction, it's just stuff happens, and we experience it. That's what experience is. It's the stuff happening. But it's not just in the brain, it's the whole body. It's the body in relation to other bodies, minds, and I think we are not only embodied, but embedded obviously in a society and a culture. And we're nothing without that. And everything within that, you tell me something that isn't a story, okay? There is nothing that isn't a story. A scientific paper is a story. A mathematical formula is a story. E equals mc squared is a story. We can't get outside of the framework of stories. We can talk about them in different ways, and we can experience them in different ways.
My question was more about psychoanalysis, and was more about if it works to changing the story of someone, to manipulate the story of someone, to manipulate the self, to transform the self.
Well, in whichever way you change the way people think about whatever, there are going to be changes in the brain. I suppose the question is, to what extent are they persisting changes in the brain? Or maybe to what extent can you have parallel stories? And I think the jazz musician Pat Martino is a really good example of how you can have parallel stories. Because he's not amnesic now in the sense that he can remember things from one day to the next. So I might not see him for a year or two, and then when we meet, we have lots of stories together. We've spent a lot of time together, and he's accurate in his recall. But for memories before the hemorrhage and before the surgery, he's had to relearn an awful lot. And his personal story is to a certain extent different depending on who he's with or who you talk to. But if he's with them, he will adopt that story as his story. So I mentioned he tells a story about when he was walking down Hollywood Boulevard, and he sees a pair of fantastic sunglasses in the window of a car sales room. He said, "I've got to have those sunglasses." And he goes in there, and the salesman says, "Sorry, sir, they come with the car. It's a Porsche." He said, "Okay, I'll buy the Porsche then." He's never owned a Porsche, okay? You talk to some people and they play along with the story. Someone told him that story and he's accepted it as part of his biography. Other people say, "No, Pat has never owned a Porsche." But he firmly believes it when if he's on that particular story of his life, then that's his story.
I think there's a lot of that just goes on all the time. Just as soon as your parents name you, they've made a story that you just have to kind of incorporate as your biography. Okay, therefore I am called Holly, and this is where I was born. Where do you draw the line between this kind of these narratives that we just take on and have to just accept that they are us or that they are our narratives? And
well, I suppose some of them are just pure confabulation. And if you get a group of people, and there's a consensus that Pat Martino never owned a Porsche. He probably didn't ever own a Porsche.
He hasn't got the receipt.
Huh?
He hasn't got the
Yes,
receipt.
he never had the money. Jazz musicians don't make any money. But I think you're right. Obviously, but I'm just saying that that actually happens kind of constantly, that this kind of, as soon as I introduce myself, there's this kind of element of lying to somebody, or this element of fantasy or fiction in sort of the way that I introduce myself or interact with somebody else, or the fantasy of who you are is not who you are, but I talk to you as if you are the person that I have decided that you are, and spend every day kind of this better version, wittier.
No, I just wanted to introduce the idea here that I think that this thing of listening to yourself is operative here, because in terms of we're wholly material, and yet everything is a story. There's nothing that's not a story. There's some kind of gap between those two things somehow, and I know I know technically not, but I think
I don't know whether there is or there isn't. What I'm saying is I'm quite happy with that story.
Yes, but
it doesn't bother me.
This thing of when you tell a story about your life, it might be something you remember and you're remembering it as you tell it. As soon as you hear yourself tell it and you hear your own voice and you hear it going forth out of your body, out in front of you, it's somehow changed.
But I also think it's possible to believe two different things at the same time, or to believe something to be true and know it to be false.
Yes.
Just a little story. A friend of mine who very, very good scientist. I hadn't seen him for a long time, and I knew him when I was an undergraduate. And his wife died. It's about 10 years ago. And I went over to New Zealand, and moved to New Zealand. I went over there and had a drink with him on the harbour side in Auckland. And he was telling me the stories. He said the day after the funeral, he was sitting there with his children, and a bird flew in through the window. It never happened before. Sang very sweetly for a couple of minutes and flew out again. And he said, I knew that was Liz. I just knew. And she came to tell us, it's all going to be fine, you're going to be okay. He said, but of course it wasn't true, you know. So, and I honestly think it's like sort of negative capability. He really did believe it, but also he didn't believe it at the same time.
Why wasn't it true?
Because he doesn't believe in immaterial souls that can occupy the body of a bird that come to sing to you. He doesn't accept that as a possibility.
I really think that's exactly the same feeling of introducing myself to somebody and saying my name. Like, I know it's true, but I also know really that's not true. That is just this kind of thing I've got to say, but that's not actually, that is a kind of a lie that we've all just got to kind of accept this kind of negative, this kind of bad faith feeling of introducing yourself. And this kind of, I think the name is this kind of lie that we just have, and that you've got one and we've got one, and so we just all accept this lie of our names.
A lie? Why is it a lie?
Yeah, I see a name as the opposite of a lie. You know, a name is like a truth that has emerged that you find in the universe and sort of becomes you. I don't know, I had that feeling because I just had a daughter this year, and once I sort of felt the name, it was as if it already had happened. But well, I kind of feel that way about my name. I feel like it was an inevitable reality, but I do believe in immaterial spirits, so. So I do believe in that interaction.
Yeah. I think I was talking to someone last week about the book, was it the end of the bicameral mind? Or that
it's called The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. Yeah.
Yes. I was talking to someone about that, and she was using that as a sort of backdrop to saying that she does tarot, and she started doing tarot every day. And yes, she doesn't sort of believe in it, but it's like you have a question and you draw the card, and then the card helps you answer the question in some way. And I kind of feel like, yes, working on a piece of art or a text is a bit like that. I come upon some kind of metaphors or sort of just words, like we decided there would be a basset hound and a goat, and then we just kind of do the sort of work to find significance in them and kind of commit to them and sort of live around and find that they are the answer to the question we had, even though they sort of weren't. I feel like it's a similar kind of process, maybe.
I would like to know.
Goats.
Sorry. I would like to know maybe if there are some questions. Are there any questions? We have a question. João de Pina Cabral. João de Pina Cabral was with us last year as an anthropologist.
How are you?
Good.
Lovely seeing you.
I have a question about the forest.
Oh, it was beautiful. Right?
And the tiger in the forest.
Paul, sorry, I think it's for you.
My question is about the tiger in the forest.
Okay.
And the forest. Does this forest know words? In other words, is this forest more like my dog, or is this forest more like me?
I think, first of all, it's a fanciful idea. It might be true. I don't know whether it's true or not. It would depend on the configuration of the raindrops and the leaves. So sometimes it might be like you, sometimes it might be like your dog. It might be like an orgasm. It might be like, you know, a flash of lightning or a wonderful line of poetry. The point of that little piece is that if you take the materialist story, then it really does come down to patterns of interaction between neurons. So it really, what else? If it's something else, then you have to go into the Cartesian immaterial soul. And so once you say, well, it's, and we, of course at this point we don't know enough about the brain to say, well, it's that pattern that produces that experience. But if we could, then it would be extremely unlikely that given all the things that happen in the world, you know, waves on the ocean, winds going through the Amazon rainforest, it's bound to happen, isn't it? You know, rain, you know, clouds colliding, flashes of consciousness.
There is this anthropologist that wrote a book trying to argue that forests think.
Oh, really?
Yes. His argument is that forests think and that dogs think. And I think in a way he probably has a point. Like you were saying, depending on the patterns. But what I always wonder is, do they think like, you know, I came to learn words, my grandfather came to learn words, my grandfather's grandfather came to learn words. There is a recurrence in this pattern.
Yeah, but the point is that if at the moment that Descartes came up with, I think, therefore I am, okay? If there's the same configuration of raindrops and wind and leaves in the forest thinks, I think, therefore I am. And then it goes away, okay? So, I don't want to push this too far, but it's true. I have. Yeah. Well, I've played the game with some very eminent philosophers, and no one has. They kind of laugh at it, but no one has really had a real knockdown argument against it. I don't care if it's true or not. It's just fun.
It's interesting because this. I don't know if I can agree with you. I like very much this idea of the forest thinking or thinking differently than humans. So having its own way to think or to process or to create or hallucinate. But I know for sure that trees, they send messages to each other already. We know that. We know that a tree that is attacked by animals can transform its fruit into bitter fruit and then can release in the air some toxins and advise all the other trees that something weird is happening. And so all the other trees also, they become bitter. And animals, they don't bite them. We know that trees and forests, they create their own environment as much as we do. Probably forests, maybe they don't think like us, but for sure they have a culture of their own. So I really much like your idea of forest thinking, or the whole planet thinking through flashlights of thunders and stuff. But I think that also they are doing this without us projecting ourselves in them.
No, I was just going to say, I've always been a fan of Vygotsky, who says that language, you know, is a tool, like you were talking about. As humans, we learn language over and over again, but I think it's just of practical use to us to have what we call language, but every living being has language with its counterparts or its species, because they all are communicating and thinking, I feel, in some way that is of practical use to them.
They have icons, they have indices. Do they have symbols? And symbols. And this is the question. This was my question about the forest. I agree with the guy when he says that forests think, yeah, well, they do think, but do they have symbols? In other words, do they think like me? And that's where the matter seems to be interesting.
I'll just say I don't even think that we have symbols. I think we have symbols, but we don't.
Thank you for that. I think we clearly do have symbols, and we okay. Come on. I think that clearly trees do communicate in some ways, and all living creatures, living things communicate in practical ways. But they don't, as far as we know, communicate symbolically. They can't think in the abstract. They don't project into the past and the future in the way that we have this sort of wonderful facility for mental time travel.
Yes,
Any other question?
I wanted to ask you what is left of the will, individual will, in your concept that we are nobody, in a way.
The will?
Mm.
In the context of sort of free will and determinism debate, I think it's philosophically an absolutely unresolved question. I have never seen a complete demolition of the idea that determinism, hard determinism, is true. I just haven't seen that. Now, there may be. The way I think about it is, at the level that I think the self is effectively an act of imagination. And at the level that we talk about selves, we bring in notions like free will. They only become meaningful at that level. And that's the level that we all live in and operate at. So I'm quite happy to think I've got perfect freedom of will, even, you know, it's another example of believing one thing and sensing the opposite. If it were the case that my every movement and every action had been determined since the dawn of time, it wouldn't worry me in the least. Because at the level that things mean stuff to me, that things matter to me, I have freedom. And I've got this might be very trivial. But actually on that same trip to New Zealand, when I saw my old friend Tony, I was completely jet-lagged. And I was watching a football match in the middle of the night. And in New Zealand, they show the whole match, right? And this is the game that had been played the previous day. So if it was my team, if I'd wanted to know the result, I could have easily sort of checked on the phone what the result was. But what mattered was actually living the match and not knowing the result. And that's the way I think about how we, you know, I can live with the idea of determinism because we don't know the result. We just live in the moment. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that's very nice. It's so you play the game of that there is a will. So you act as if
it's
there
not
is.
A game. It's not a game. It's at one level I really do have freedom. As long as I'm not constrained or controlled in certain ways, I really do have freedom of choice. It may be that the choices I make are predetermined. But the notion of freedom of the will don't have any meaning at that level of cause and effect. It's a completely different universe of discourse. So as I say, I don't have an existential crisis about the possibility that determinism is true. Because in the life that matters to me, I have complete freedom to do what I want.
This is like the Calvinists, who believe God determined everything, but each one of them had to live the moment. It was all determined.
It is a bit like that, although I don't really want to identify myself with the Calvinists. It is in a way, yeah. Shit.
Any other question? Any other question? Okay, nice. So maybe we just can finish here. What do you think? That's a good point, right? Thank you so much. It was wonderful. Before you go, I would like to read one poem, very short, from Ko-un, back on the seat. Ko-un is going to be here on Sunday, and it's about this idea of who you are. So Ko-un, at a certain moment of his life, he went to a monastery, became a monk, Buddhist monk, and that's when the first time he met the old monk, its master. Who are you? Asked the monk to the younger Ko-un. I'm hungry, replied the Ko-un. Then eat first, said the monk. Thank you.